The Trump administration has appointed a convicted war criminal, a guy who covered up the massacre of 1,000 people, as their special envoy to Venezuela. Elliot Abrams, the guy that was pardoned by George Bush Sr. as part of the Iran-Contra pardons that stopped the investigation into Bush himself. It's really pretty amazing. We have a crisis right now in America. We are experiencing a crisis. You know, for years, I have been saying on this program, and I wrote about this in my book, Crash of 2016, which should have been titled The Coming Crash, rather than putting a year on it. But in any case, I wrote about this, I've talked about this many times, that if you look at the arc of American history, of the history of our republic, the political and practical history of the United States, what you see is that the times that we have had significant lurches forward in a progressive direction, when the country has moved in a positive and forward-looking direction, have always been after great crises. You had, the tax, the Stamp Act, and then the Tea Act of 1773, as I recall, followed by the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, and boom, you've got the American Revolution, and then you've got this progressive change, right? A substantial one, self-governance. And then you have the Civil War, and after the Civil War, another progressive change, the passage of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, things like this. Now, there was always a backlash to that progressive change, but it was there. You had the great crisis, the great, it was referred to as the Great Panic of 1893, which lasted all the way up till 1898. This was one of the worst depressions America had ever experienced. It was the second worst compared to the depression we had during Andrew Jackson's presidency in the 1830s. And that then in some ways led to, or that crisis, I would say, was exacerbated by the assassination of McKinley in 1901, putting Teddy Roosevelt into the White House. Teddy was McKinley's vice president. And Teddy Roosevelt used that crisis, right? Never let a crisis go to waste. Teddy Roosevelt used that crisis to go on this trust-busting thing, and breaking up big corporations and taxing the rich, putting into place an estate tax, and banning rich people and corporations from participating in politics. The 1907 Tillman Act that made it a felony for a corporation to put money into federal elections or politicians running for federal office. I mean, it was pretty amazing stuff. And then, of course, the great crash of 1929 and World War II, which led to FDR and the New Deal, which transformed America with Social Security and long-term unemployment and the government as the employer of last resort, all these policies that came out of that. Even the Vietnam War, I would say, that crisis, Richard Nixon and all that, led to some substantial attempts, anyway, at progressive change. I think that LBJ probably would not have done his great society if he didn't have the Vietnam War pressing against him. So if we're looking at things that cause change, historically it's been these crashes, essentially. But I would submit to you, and this is the question that I put forward for this hour, is it possible, and I think it is, in fact, I think this is the case, that the simple fact of Donald Trump's presidency is enough of a crisis that it falls into the category of the Great Depression, of the Vietnam War, of the Panic of 1893, of the Civil War, of the Tea Act? Is it enough of a crisis for America? Has it got Americans sufficiently freaked out that crisis of Donald Trump's presidency in and of itself is going to lead to a significant progressive movement that is going to take on the status quo and that is going to elect a genuine progressive president in 2020? Do you think that's possible? And if so, who do you think is going to be the standard bearer of that? Louise and I watched last night part of the interview that Lawrence O'Donnell had with Elizabeth Warren. I'm guessing that he booked that kind of at the last minute as a rebuttal to CNN doing a town hall with Kamala Harris. We then went and watched the town hall with Kamala Harris, and she just kicked it out of the park. She said that she's in favor of Medicare for all, that she's in favor of debt-free college, that she's in favor of the Green New Deal. Some of her endorsements were not quite as full-throated as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but they were there. Meanwhile, there's an article in the paper today that Democrats in New York are planning a primary challenge against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Yeah, they're going to primary her because she's not, corporate enough, right? I think what we're seeing right here is the edge of the old age and the beginning of the new. We're looking at a political collapse in the Republican Party being brought about, and frankly, a political collapse in the Democratic Party among essentially kind of the old guard, being brought about by the attempted capture of both political parties by the billionaire class, the bankster class, the Walmart class, basically the giant corporations and the billionaires that they make. And my sense of it is that Americans have had enough. So, you've got probably the two leading contenders for president right now are Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris. And actually, I should reverse the order, Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. Everybody says Joe Biden's at the top of the polls. I don't believe it. I think Joe Biden is at the top of name recognition. And, 7 out of 10 Americans right at this particular moment in time, or 7 out of 10 Democrats even, are probably not paying careful attention to who might be running for president. The primary season has not even started. And I think that name recognition that Biden has is going to fade away really fast. I'm wondering about Beto O'Rourke. Has he got a chance? I'm wondering what Bernie is going to do and how much Bernie can translate, 4 years ago into this year. Or are people going to say, well, his time has passed, he had a good shot at it? What do you think? Who do you see that could take on Trump? Who do you see who could take on the Republicans? Who do you see who could take on even, the people in the Democratic Party who want to primary Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez because, she's too liberal? Where do we go with this? How does this work out? How does this shake out? Or do you think that I'm completely wrong, that the Trump presidency is not a crisis? For example, here's some of the things that tell me that this is a crisis, the Trump presidency. Down in Florida, you've got legislation sponsored by a Republican from Ocala, Senator Dennis Baxley. I realize this is not Trump, but this is along. He wants schools to teach different worldviews on the issues of evolution and climate change. He says, nothing's ever settled if it's science because people are always questioning science. Right. It's unresolved, says a guy who wants to teach climate change denial. Number one. Number two, there are these two chemicals called PFOA and PFOS. PFOA and PFOS have been linked to kidney cancer, testicular cancer, high blood pressure, and a whole variety of other ailments. These things cause disease. They are in the drinking water of 110 million Americans at levels that have been demonstrated in lab tests to cause harm. And the Trump administration just announced that they are not going to set drinking water limits for these two chemicals because these two chemicals make a lot of money for 3M. These are the chemicals that are used in manufacturing Teflon, basically. And they get in your drinking water, and they are in about a third of our drinking water. It's a big problem. PFOA in West Virginia, for example, even Shelley Moore Capito, the Republican from West Virginia, has flipped out about this. Federal scientists last summer concluded that PFOA and PFOS pose dangers at extremely low concentrations in a health assessment that the Trump administration officials initially tried to block. How is that not a crisis? Right? Donald Trump, here's another one. Donald Trump is watching Fox and Friends 2 days ago. Yesterday. Yesterday morning, he's watching Fox and Friends. Fox and Friends puts on this wackadoodle North Dakota Republican, Representative Aaron McWilliams, who says that, we need to start teaching the Bible in our schools. Trump tweets out, after watching Fox and Friends, this is how bizarre this is. Tell me this isn't a crisis. Trump tweets out, numerous states introducing Bible literacy classes, giving students the option of studying the Bible. Starting to make a turn back? Great! Exclamation mark. Really? This isn't a crisis? And then, Elliott Abrams, as I mentioned, in the beginning, this is the guy who tried to conceal the massacre of 1,000, mostly women and children, murdered by U.S.-trained Salvadoran guerrillas. Murdered. Elliott Abrams was going to go to prison for this and other crimes around Iran-Contra. And he was pardoned by George Bush Sr. as part of a cover-up of crimes that George Bush Sr. himself was involved in. A cover-up, by the way, that was engineered by William Barr, the guy that Trump wants to make our Attorney General. Bill Barr recommended to Bush Sr. that he pardon Elliott Abrams and Casper Weinberger and 4 other people in order to stop the special prosecutor, at that time it was called there was another name for it, but in any case, today we call it the special prosecutor. Independent counsel, I think it was called, but in any case, in order to stop that investigation, Bill Barr told Bush Sr., just pardon these guys. This convicted war criminal was just put in charge of our policies with regard to Venezuela. A guy who oversaw a cover-up of the slaughter of 1,000, mostly women and children, by Salvadoran death squads that we had trained during the Reagan administration. You tell me this is not a crisis? You've got lobbyists running the EPA, lobbyists running the Interior Department, lobbyists running the FDA, lobbyists running the USDA. This is not a crisis?